What if creativity isn't a talent you're born with, but a way you move through a Tuesday? It's not your job title on LinkedIn, you don't need a book deal, you don't even need a studio filled with synthesizers and audio cables. Maybe, just maybe, creativity is the tiny, almost invisible choices you make between emails, on your lunch break, while you're making dinner. As I was listening back to our first week's shows on Do Radio, that's the thing that kept jumping out at me. There aren't these two groups, the creatives and everyone else, but there's this quieter idea that all of us are making stuff all of the time. If we haven't met before, I'm Jon Kaye. I'm the presenter of Tomorrow's World on Do Radio. And every week I sit down with all 8 hours of conversations from across the radio station. And I know most people don't have the time or bandwidth to do that. So these videos are my way of turning all of that wisdom into something shorter and punchier. Now, it's not intended to replace listening to the radio shows. I totally encourage you to do that. Think of it like a notebook for the station. I'm calling this radio series the Do Radio Academy. And I'm looking for the threads that run through different guests, different shows, different lives. And then I bring those threads here to see what they might mean for the rest of us who are just trying to live, work, make things and stay human. Now, from our first week of shows, I've already made a video about living a rich life, and you can watch that one here. But I couldn't help noticing that creativity kept coming up across all of the shows. The business shows, the creativity shows, the health and well-being shows, but not in the way we usually talk about it. When you say the word creative, most people picture the same kind of person. Paint splattered, maybe a bit bohemian, definitely not them. But across these 8 shows, creativity didn't show up like that at all. It sounded like a retired teacher sitting with a notebook, wondering about time. It sounded like 2 lifelong friends who love radio so much they accidentally built a station. It sounded like a dad in a shed stealing 5 minutes to drum between Zoom calls. It even showed up in an artist who was playing with artificial intelligence at the very edge of what's possible. And what struck me is that nobody really claimed the title. Nobody said, I'm a, capital C creative. What they did instead was describe how they arrange their days, what they pay attention to, how they respond to something inside them. So that's what I want to explore with you here. Creativity not as a talent some people get handed to at birth, but as a way of living. One of the clearest expressions of this came from Ruth Gendler. Ruth's a writer and an artist, but the way she talks about creativity is so much wider than that. She describes these very simple practices: writing by hand, sending letters, playing with calligraphy. None of it is about content, it's about touching language, about slowing down enough that a word doesn't just fly past your eyes on a screen, but actually lands in your body. And what I loved is how she kept circling back to ordinary life. She talks about making soup, making sense of your day, making time to notice the way light falls across a room. For her, creativity isn't reserved for the studio or for the classroom. It's woven into how she relates to her own thoughts and to other people. And then there are the people who wouldn't tick the, creative industry box on a form, but who exhibit creativity through the way they dress, how they solve problems at work, the way they host their friends. They're not trying to impress anyone, they're just letting their preferences and their curiosity leak into the way they do things. And listening to Ruth, I found myself thinking, maybe creativity is just the name we give to the moments we decide not to do it in the default way. The moments we bring maybe a bit more of ourselves to the party. And that idea shows up again in a very different context with Nick Parker. Now, on paper, Nick is a writer, but the more he talks, the less that label seems to hold. He describes this shed where he works. It's his office, but it's also full of instruments and tools and half-finished experiments. He'll be doing client work, writing copy, sending emails, and then he notices this familiar restlessness, that twitch to reach for his phone, check social media, find a quick hit of novelty. Now, instead of scrolling, he stands up. He might sit at his drum kit and just play for 5 minutes, or start folding origami, or potter in the garden. It's not a grand creative ritual. It's not a productivity hack. It's just a small, deliberate choice to redirect that kind of searching energy into something that feels nourishing rather than numbing. And what I hear in that is a kind of respect for the way human attention actually works. He's not trying to bully himself into being a machine that can focus for 6 hours straight. He knows his mind moves in these bursts, and he's filled his environment with things that give those bursts somewhere playful to land. That to me is creative living. Not just I wrote a book, but I configured my day so there are these little pockets where I can follow my curiosity without blowing up my life. Then there's Rick and Adam, who almost accidentally built a radio station out of a lifetime of tiny creative acts. As kids, they measured their lives not in school years, but in which songs were playing on the radio. Fast forward a few decades and that playful obsession has turned into buzz radio. But what's important is how they got there. There wasn't a 5-year plan to launch a disruptive audio platform. Instead, there were these tiny little improvisations, volunteering at a community radio station, saying yes to a last-minute DJ slot on the radio, figuring out how to broadcast from home when the pandemic hit. Now, each of these steps was essentially them saying, look, this matters enough to tinker with. Let's see if we can make something. That's creativity as devotion, sticking close to the thing you love long enough that it starts to make new shapes in your life. And then on what seems like the complete opposite end of the spectrum, there's Chris Branch. Chris runs an AI creative studio. Now, on the surface, that sounds hyper-technical, abstract, kind of frankly intimidating. But as he talks, you realise his world is deeply creative. He describes working with brands at the very edge of what's possible with generative AI models. And instead of treating AI as a threat, he treats it as an amplifier, a way of generating ideas, sounds, textures, images that humans can then respond to, in this case, him. He's very clear that the most interesting work happens when the tech is in the room with people who already live at the creative edge. It's not replacing them, it's prodding them, offering new combinations they wouldn't have thought of on their own. And this is another version of creativity as a way of living, staying close enough to the frontier of your field even when it feels overwhelming, choosing to surf that wave of change rather than building a very safe, very rigid business. In Chris's case, that means deliberately staying small. So he has the freedom to keep learning, experimenting and playing. He's doing the thing. He's working with AI. He's not outsourcing it. He really understands what it can do and what it can't. Now, all the guests on this week's shows are doing something similar. They're arranging their lives around what makes them feel most alive. They're looking for ways to bring that aliveness into the container of a normal day. And they're willing to look, frankly, a bit odd, writing letters in a digital world, drumming between emails, starting a radio station when everyone else is starting podcasts, even betting on AI as artificial inspiration rather than an enemy. And the more I listened, the more I realised we talk about creativity like it's this rare commodity, but what we're really talking about is permission. Permission to trust your instincts, permission to do something in a way that might not make sense to everyone else. Permission to value how something feels on the inside over how it looks on the outside. And that's where you come in, because this isn't just about Ruth's notebooks or Nick's drum kit or Rick and Adam's radio station. This is about how you notice the tiny moments in your own life where that same impulse shows up. The moment you decide to cook instead of ordering in because you want to put your hands on the ingredients and make something from scratch. The moment you choose to walk the long way home because there's a tree you really like on that route. The way you arrange your desk or your calendar or your weekend. If you've grown up with the story that you're not creative, those moments can feel insignificant, but listening to these guests, it's clear that's exactly where a creative life lives. Not in the big gestures, but in the way you relate to your time, your attention, your tools, your people. So, what do we do with all of this? Now, for me, the heart of this theme is simple. Creativity is less about what you produce and more about how you participate. And everyone can do that. Ruth participates in language in a way that slows it down and makes it tangible. Nick participates in his own attention, redirecting it towards drums and wood and paper instead of the endless scrolling. Rick and Adam participate in their love of radio so fully that it eventually crystallized into a station. And Chris, he participates in a rapidly changing field with curiosity rather than fear. None of our guests are waiting for permission. None of them are asking, am I creative enough to do this? They're just responding to what lights them up in the context of very ordinary, very human lives, jobs, families, deadlines, commutes, and woven through all of that, a willingness to make. If you're a founder, a leader, a freelancer, a parent, or just a human trying to find your way, this matters. Because the story you hold about creativity shapes what you allow yourself to try. If creativity is this rare talent that other people have, you'll keep outsourcing your imagination, your sense of possibility, your joy. But if you start seeing creativity as a way of living, a way of arranging your day so that there's a bit more curiosity, a bit more play, a bit more you, then suddenly there's room. Room to experiment, room to shift things one notch closer to who you actually are. If this theme of creativity is landing for you, I'd encourage you to go and listen to Do Radio. Now, especially the show that we have called I'm Not Creative. The conversations aren't neat or polished, they're messy and honest and full of little moments that don't fit into a short video like this. And that's kind of the point. Creativity lives in those messy, honest places. So tune in, keep listening, and see what it wakes up in your own life. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.